Beginning back in 2015, China began enacting a series of laws that gave them essentially unfettered access to the networks and databases of any company operating in China or headquartered in China, which includes ByteDance, TikTok's parent company. What that means is the national security law, national intelligence law, and cybersecurity laws of China give unfettered access to the Ministry of Personal Security, the Ministry of Public Security. Anytime they go to a company in China and say, you need to provide us this data, you need to provide us access to their network, there is not an option. This isn't a subpoena and warrant process. They either cooperate or they get shut down. And so all of the data that TikTok is collecting from our mobile devices, our contact lists, our individual locations at any given time,
physical locations, hour to hour,
include and facial recognition, your gait from the way you do these dances on TikTok, and I've seen you, John, they're good dances.
I decidedly am not on TikTok, I will tell you, but thanks for the,
But they're collecting all of this data, and they're utilizing it in order to feed their artificial intelligence training algorithms. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. They have more training data for their artificial intelligence than anywhere on Earth.
Yeah.
What they don't have is training data on Caucasians, on Africans, on Europeans, and because they're primarily collecting information from their giant surveillance system that's all across their country on Han Chinese. And so to expand that, they're utilizing things like TikTok in order to collect that information. So that's one aspect of it. The data collection is certainly a problem. The other aspect of it is that TikTok is now the single greatest tool of propaganda ever created. It reaches 140 million Americans every single day. 140 million Americans. And it can be tailored to go very specifically to any demographic, to any individual, and send them a message that's going to alter the way they think, alter the way they act, and impact them very specifically. Think about all of the advertisements you receive from Google or from Facebook that are based on the emails you send. If you type into Gmail that you're thinking about buying Nike shoes, suddenly you get all of these Nike shoe advertisements on your Google feed. Now imagine that China has that capability, but they're doing it to undermine our political process, to make you think that President Biden is the worst person on earth.
So let's actually go there, and you know, this book is not just about China, it's also about Russia. It's not exclusively about those two, but it's about the threats they primarily represent. Bill, your book talks about not only, I think, the relatively well-known attempts to influence the election in 2016, but those that occurred in 20, and new revelations that came out more recently about the degree to which Russia in particular, via the IRA, was trying to exacerbate our political divides, often along racial lines. But certainly, I mean, you know, all the aspects of polarization that feed into that. Tell folks some new examples of that, some newer examples, because some information came out relatively recently.
My favorite story is, based on an interview we did, is that a single Russian entity funded by and supported by the Russian intelligence service creates a website that says, in English, all teachers should carry guns in American schools. And it's translated in English, it's fluent, it's compelling, and it works its way into the American information ecosystem, primarily the conservative end of the spectrum. The same organization then creates another website in fluent English that says it's a sacrilege against everything Americans believe in to have American teachers carrying guns in schools. So this then infiltrates into the American ecosystem, and Americans are not particularly sophisticated about where does this website come from. It's in English, they make the arguments I like, they embrace it. So the Russians then can watch this debate, it's a wedge issue, and if the wedge issue starts to die down, they can fire it up again. This website starts calling these guys, you sons of bitches, you don't know what you're talking about, they call back. So they can raise the emotional temperature of the wedge issues. They've done the same with Roe v. Wade. They jumped on that and exacerbated the bitter divides we have, which we created these bitter divides. They did not create them, but they are exacerbating, exploiting. So that's my favorite example. The Russians are better at that than the Chinese. The Chinese propaganda seems to be aimed at undermining our, as you say, the racial harmony. The it was Zhao Lijian. What was the name of the foreign ministry's wolf warrior? It was Zhao Lijian. Zhou Lijian? Zhao Lijian. He made remarks saying that, well, COVID is having a disproportionately negative impact on African Americans, and it's all because of the racism of the American system. So in that sense, the Chinese pile on the racial and ethnic divide, but I think the Russians are more sophisticated in understanding the wedge issue.
And then sometimes these narratives often are picked up by unwitting people who amplify them. Sometimes people in positions of real responsibility or at least political influence, which is not so striking. All right, Mike, okay, I want to go back to one of the threats you all described that I think there's been, David Sanger and other folks have done reporting on, but about infiltration into critical infrastructure. The evidence we have and the threat that represents, to what extent has it been mitigated if we know about it?
So I would say if we know about it is the answer. Because the bottom line is we don't, and that's the scary thing. The vast majority of American critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. The private sector is who owns and operates the equipment. They're the ones who manage the critical infrastructure, be it the electric grid or telecommunications systems. And we rely on the private sector to operate these things that we, in turn, rely upon for national security. And so you think of all of the American bases that are scattered all across the country, every single one of them is powered by a private sector entity. Every single one of them relies on telecommunications from a private sector entity, whether it's Verizon or CenturyLink or any of another 100 different telecommunications providers. Well, who is ensuring their cybersecurity? We have regulations and we have a stick. The regulation says you must be up to a certain point, but when you start to get into the rural areas for telecommunications and for the electric grid, they're smaller and smaller. The companies themselves are smaller and smaller, have smaller and smaller budgets. So what is the likelihood that they're able to allocate effective funds towards enhancing or to putting their cybersecurity at the degree that it needs to be, such that we're not seeing a rolling blackout, such that we're not seeing something that is taking out a significant portion of our national security infrastructure or our critical defenses? And the answer is we don't know, number one, whether or not there's been a penetration, that is. And number two, even if we did know, what would we be able to do about it? What is the stick? And the bottom line is because it's the private sector, there really isn't one. Because the private sector turns around and says, you want us to have redundant capabilities. That if we have a large power generation piece of equipment that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars to purchase, maintain, and operate, that you want us to have multiple of those in case one goes down. Okay, federal government, are you going to pay for it? And the answer is no, the federal government's not, because it's a private sector entity. And so the private sector, then, we get into this continuous tug of war where we don't have enough redundancy within our critical infrastructure to actually withstand a complex cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, and the government is not funding it appropriately.